Julian Assange touches down, inflation goes up, and the world watches a US president struggle on the debate stage. It's been a jam-packed week, full of surprises. I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. Just when you thought US politics couldn't get any stranger, there's now serious talk of swapping out Joe Biden for another, much younger Democrat candidate after his faltering debate performance against Donald Trump. What happens in this presidential contest has enormous ramifications for the world, and the chances of a second Trump presidency have just gone up. Here in Australia, Anthony Albanese is trying to give his own government some momentum, talking up the tax cuts and other budget goodies that will flow from tomorrow. It's been complicated by another jump in inflation, prompting fears of more interest rate hikes on the way. The showstopper in Canberra during the week, though, was the arrival of Julian Assange. The return of this Australian citizen was broadly welcomed, even if he remains a deeply divisive figure.
We have major breaking news.
WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange is expected to plead guilty to violating US espionage law.
Julian Assange was a political prisoner, and his freedom took a political solution.
Mr Assange's case has dragged on for too long. That's something I've said as Labor leader, it's something I've said as Prime Minister, and it's something that I will have more to say about once these legal proceedings have concluded.
How does it feel to be a free man, Mr Assange?
Julian Assange's journey from enemy of the state to free Australian citizen is almost over.
I don't know if I can do this. You couldn't have possibly been up against more significant power structures in this campaign. You don't give up, you just keep going.
This is what standing up for Australians around the world looks like.
And they've done it for political reasons, and the Albanese government always acts politically.
The things that Australians are concerned about aren't Mr Assange. Like, they are struggling to pay their mortgages.
Personally speaking, Julian Assange is no hero of mine. He put lives in danger.
To my knowledge, that never happened, but the more I think about it, his actions actually, in my mind, saved many lives.
So we're one step closer to seeing Julian. How are you feeling?
Beyond excited.
The WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange has arrived home in Australia.
Oh, wow.
And earlier tonight, I was pleased to speak with Mr Assange to welcome him home.
Julian thanked him and the team and told the Prime Minister that he had saved his life.
And I think the Prime Minister's embrace of Mr Assange might not age very well once Mr Assange starts tweeting again.
I think it sends a chill down the spine of journalists worldwide that this precedent has been set.
Do you see him as a journalist?
That is a matter of opinion.
The Prime Minister should have seen that there were clear lines not to cross in relation to somebody who just that day had pleaded guilty to espionage charges.
If an Australian Prime Minister talking to an Australian citizen challenges the relationship with the United States, there's a problem with the relationship. Thanks everyone for coming today.
My guest this morning is the Deputy Prime Minister, Richard Marles. And later in the program, we'll also hear from the Labor Senator who crossed the floor, Fatima Payman. First, let's check what's making news. And Fatima Payman has told the Sunday Times she can't promise she won't cross the floor again, and says she hasn't had any contact with colleagues since she did so on Tuesday. We'll hear more from the Senator later. In the 9 newspapers, the East Coast will need 13 gigawatts of new gas-fired electricity generation, the equivalent of 26 new gas plants within the next 25 years. That's to back up the rollout of renewables. The finding comes from the latest roadmap produced by the Australian Energy Market Operator. And the ABC's Tom Lowry reports the Greens will seek to introduce legislation this week to set up a Truth and Justice Commission, 9 months on from the failed Voice referendum. One of the leaders of the Uluru Statement, Pat Anderson, has backed the move. She's called out the Albanese government's silence since the failed referendum. Lots to get through this morning. We're going to start, though, with Julian Assange. The Prime Minister was happy to take credit for his part in securing this return, but he was careful not to defend the actions of the WikiLeaks founder. Peter Dutton, meanwhile, didn't comment on this at all. There's caution about embracing such a divisive figure and perhaps some trepidation about what Assange might do next. Let's see what the panel makes of it. We're joined this week by Mark Kenny, Tom Crowley and Samantha Maiden. Very good morning to all of you. Mark, we'll get to how the politicians have been treading a bit carefully on Julian Assange, but let's just focus on what actually happened with him in this plea deal. He has issued a guilty plea under the US Espionage Act. What does this mean? Does it set a worrying precedent for press freedom, or is this a special, unique case?
Well, it's definitely a unique case at this stage. It's an extraordinary case and one that's had the attention of the world and has really kind of drawn out a whole sort of coalition of quite interesting figures in support of Julian Assange, both here and in the US. So that's kind of unique and interesting in its own right. As for the precedent that it actually sets in terms of the plea deal, well, there's some argument about that. It's not actually a finding of a court. It's a deal that's been ratified by a court. That's what that process happening in Saipan was all about. But really, this is it is in a sense a political settlement. I do think that the use of espionage laws for prosecuting journalists is an extraordinary event in itself. But that was we knew that was the approach of the US already.
This was the point made by his lawyer Jennifer Robinson as well, that the prosecution itself was the problem.
This is journalism. This is the criminalisation of journalism. And while the plea deal does not set a judicial precedent, it's not a court decision, the prosecution itself sets a precedent that can be used against the rest of the media.
And look, that concern we heard throughout the day from Jennifer Robinson, Sam, but I guess it goes to whether what Julian Assange did was journalism.
It's interesting because for a long time, Assange didn't always identify as a journalist, if you want to use those terms. He talked about wanting to destroy journalism and believed that the journalism, project was broken, if you like. I think that he's a flawed individual. There's no doubt about that. But it's very uncomfortable, I think, as a journalist, to support the idea that somehow people should be prosecuted for exposing information. So the idea that he's a flawed person, the idea that he did things that were wrong, such as not redact information, those things I think can also sit with the idea that it was time to resolve the issue politically.
And in terms of how politicians here reacted, as you mentioned, Mark, there was quite an interesting spectrum of politicians who long supported him and were absolutely celebrating. But the PM, Tom, to you, he obviously wanted everyone to know that he'd made this happen or helped make this happen, but he never actually defended the actions of Assange.
He seemed determined to get through the whole week just sort of saying the same phrase over and over again of different people will have different views, but this has happened, it's good that it's come to a conclusion. Peter Dutton didn't say much either. It sort of felt like mostly the coalition were planning to go through the week without saying much until maybe they just sort of got to the point where they were just a little bit sick of all the talk about him, and a couple of them broke ranks. Exactly. I think it was the photo that the Prime Minister tweeted that prompted Simon Birmingham to sort of say.
So Simon Birmingham, Shadow Foreign Minister, he was he saw it as inappropriate and unnecessary that he would call Julian Assange to welcome him to Australia after he'd just issued this guilty plea under the US Espionage Act, that it wouldn't go down well with the Americans. Was it a mistake, that phone call?
Well, I think in the end, there were always going to be some political shenanigans about this, but I think sort of as Sam says, in a sense, this is almost not a debate that we need or want our politicians to be the ones having. I think especially it's sort of almost more important for us as journalists and the public to be talking about it. I think Sam makes a really good point that you almost need to separate what we think about Assange and whether we think he was a good journalist or should even be called a journalist with the kind of matter of principle here and being very wary about any circumstance where governments are policing the publication of information. And I think it's worth remembering that important principle of setting any law. You're never going to catch all the guilty people. You're never going to spare all the innocent people. You're always on a spectrum between those two things which tug against one another.
Was the phone call a problem?
I don't think the phone call was a problem. I think the reaction was a little bit overheated, frankly, the suggestion that there shouldn't have been a phone call. I noticed that someone said, it might have been Stella Assange, might have been Jennifer Robinson, someone said that there's nothing wrong with a little bit of kindness. Now, I think whatever you think of Julian Assange, he's been in solitary confinement effectively in a very harsh penal system, Belmarsh Prison, and that whole period before that, and the uncertainty of that and the prospect of being extradited to the US to face charges which cumulatively amounted to a death sentence, 175 years. Now, whether that would have been the sentence, who knows? But I think, if it was worth getting him out, then it was worth showing a little bit of human connection in relation to that. But it was, it's about the degree of this thing, really.
Yeah, and whether that phone call from the PM upset the Americans. I suspect the Biden administration has bigger issues to worry about right now, particularly after, do you like the segue there? After this debate performance on Friday.
Childcare, elder care, making sure that we continue to strengthen our healthcare system, making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the with the COVID. With dealing with everything we have to do with. Look, if we finally beat Medicare.
Sam, it was difficult to watch. It's prompted immediate debate about whether he can be replaced with, 4 months to go before the election?
Yeah, I think it's a reminder of the beauty and the elegance of the violence of the Australian system. If we had a Prime Minister who was doing that in the lead up to the election, the Labor Party would just be out there shooting them. Yeah. And, look, I mean, I don't think that you can run that guy to an election, not unless you want to lose. And I think it's just a terrible indictment of the US system, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans, that basically the best they can do is Joe Biden right now and Donald Trump.
I mean, Donald Trump, Tom, let's not forget, told a lot of falsehoods. There was a lot of misleading in most of the statements that he made, some from Biden too, to be fair, but a lot more from Trump. But, he gets a pat on the back for remaining relatively calm and looking more presidential than Biden did.
Trump's lies were on purpose. Biden's were just mistakes.
Well, this is the thing, and I guess that's a sign of how far the bar has fallen, where what we're holding Biden to is whether he can form coherent sentences, essentially.
Yeah,
and that was a test you didn't pass.
The line that you were talking about, the Jon Stewart piece, where they had the clip of one commentator saying that all he has to do is remain upright, which is a bit of a disturbing insight. But he's given he's made some statements this morning at a
he did a rally. It was a scripted thing though, and he looked a lot more with it, and talked about I'm not as young as I was, not as good at debates as I once was, but this was all scripted off an auto.
But he didn't sound very strong.
This is the important thing. I mean, this bloke has been bowling up to press conferences and statements in the White House pretty well for his whole term, reading off a teleprompter. Yeah. And here we see him without a teleprompter in front of him, and he was utterly hopeless.
So what do they do, mate? What are the chances, do you think, of a change?
I don't think there's any shortage of other possibilities, but the problem is the machinery, so it's what you do about it. I mean, Joe Biden is very well liked, very well respected. He's regarded as a person of integrity by his party, and that counts for something still.
Whether he needs to do the right thing by the party, though, is...
Someone needs to tap him.
I mean, he's the one who's laid out the stakes of this election.
He goes to D-Day, and he's been to many, many other commemorations where he lauds people who have given their lives for their country, and there's nothing fake about that. He believes all of that. He now needs to look at what is the best thing for his country now in terms of saving it from a second time.
It's extraordinarily selfish, the idea that you would continue to run. He clearly is not in any fit state to do another.
And the thing is, it's another 4 years. What's he going to be like in another 3 or 4 years from now?
Yeah, it's going to be a weekend at Bernie's moment. Okay. They're not careful.
Well, time to talk to the Deputy Prime Minister, Richard Marles. We're going to start on the return of Julian Assange. Most politicians agreed enough was enough. It was time he was allowed to come home. But there were mixed views on whether this Australian citizen was a journalist, a fighter for press freedom, or a danger to national security. Indeed, Richard Marles himself held some strong views on this back in 2016.
Let's be absolutely clear about this. Julian Assange is no hero. What he's done over the last few years has put a whole lot of people's lives at risk, including Australian service personnel.
Richard Marles, welcome to the program.
Morning, David. How are you?
So is it still your view that Julian Assange put lives at risk, including those of Australian service personnel?
Look, I don't think it, as we are sitting here today in 2024 with the resolution of Julian Assange's circumstances, I don't think it serves to go over the actions that he undertook in the past. The record is what it is in terms of his actions, and the record is what it is in terms of the commentary that were made about those actions, including mine. And I'm okay with that record. But I didn't say at that time, nor did anyone say at that time, that the consequence of Mr Assange's actions then should be indefinite incarceration for the rest of his life. And what we were seeing was his case drag on without resolution. It had gone on for far too long, and that's why we were working hard with both the governments of the United States and the United Kingdom to bring this to a resolution and to have Mr Assange come home. And I'm perfectly comfortable with this now and very happy that his circumstances have been brought to a resolution.
Happy that he's home, but would you be prepared to meet Julian Assange?
Oh, I don't think it's about me meeting Julian Assange. I suspect that right now Julian Assange is wanting to spend time with his family and to recover from the circumstances that he's been enduring, and that's not unreasonable.
But we know he wants a pardon as well,
Assange,
and he might be keen to get the government's support for that.
Julian Assange was an Australian overseas who was in a very difficult set of circumstances. In his particular case, his legal circumstances were not being resolved and were dragging on, and he was facing indefinite incarceration. That wasn't fair, and we were working closely, as I say, with the governments of the United States and the United Kingdom to bring resolution to that, and we're very pleased that we've been able to help.
Let me move on. One of the biggest stories in the world right now is Joe Biden and that poor debate performance in on Friday in that presidential debate. Look, there is a huge amount at stake for the world, for Australia in this election, we know. Is Joe Biden too old for the job?
Well, Joe Biden is the President of the United States. We work very closely with both him and his administration, and the Biden administration is doing a fantastic job in terms of managing America's presence in the world, a point that I have repeatedly made. And you look at Secretary Lloyd Austin, who's the Secretary of Defence, his presence in our part of the world, in the East Asian time zone, in the Indo-Pacific, has been almost constant. He has been in the region an enormous amount. That's exactly what we want to see. We work very closely with him, and we are very pleased with how we're progressing with the United States, both in terms of their position in the world, but also in terms of our equities. Most significantly, of course, the AUKUS arrangements that we have in place. Now, let me go on and say, your point is, an American election is fundamentally important, no matter when it occurs. And we are really confident that if you look at both candidates in this contest, that whoever wins in November, the alliance will remain strong, our bilateral relationship will remain strong, and the equities that we have in that relationship will be protected, including the AUKUS arrangements.
Do you also have confidence that Joe Biden would have the capacity to do the job for another 4 years, as far as Australia is concerned?
Joe Biden, as I say, is the President of the United States, and we have confidence in the President of the United States. And I'm not about to engage in a commentary about an American electoral process.
I understand you don't want to
wouldn't
weigh on that,
expect me to do that.
But you have stopped short of saying whether you think he has the capacity for the job for the next 4 years.
Oh, I think he has the capacity. I definitely think he has the capacity. But again, it's not. It's not for me to comment on the American political process. The point I'm really making is that he is the president today, and we work really closely with Joe Biden as the president. And if he's the president for the next 4 years, we'll work really closely with him over that period of time. And I've got no doubt there will be no issues in relation to that.
I want to ask you about the defence contracting scandal that was uncovered by the Auditor General during the week. It's now been referred, in fact, to the anti-corruption watchdog. This is a $1.3 billion defence contract with Thales, struck in 2020 to run munitions facilities in Australia. A defence official gave Thales confidential information, asked for a bottle of champagne from Thales, then went on to take a senior position with Thales. An assessment of the contract found it didn't offer taxpayers value for money at all. How on earth does this sort of unethical behaviour occur?
Well, we're really concerned about this set of circumstances that you've described. Obviously, this occurred between 2016 and 2020, and as a result of that, the Secretary of the Department of Defence has referred this now to the National Anti-Corruption Commission. I don't think that there is a systemic issue within Defence in relation to the way in which defence contracts are managed, but the way in which we ensure that we never have a systemic issue is to make sure that we jump on individual cases, and that's why, with the concern that we have about this set of circumstances, we've referred it to the National Anti-Corruption Commission. I think the point that I'd make here is that when you look at the whole breadth of the Commonwealth Government and the way in which we engage with Australian society, but particularly with the private sector, defence contracting is the space in which you really have the greatest exposure to working with the private sector. The defence industry is a critical partner in delivering defence capability, and that's why it's really important that this happens in a way which is completely robust, which people have total confidence in, and it's why, having seen these circumstances, we wanted this to be referred to the NAC as quickly as possible. For that total confidence, you said you're confident this isn't a systemic problem within defence when it comes to contracting. How can you be sure? Well, I do have confidence in the way in which the system operates, and I have that confidence based on my knowledge as the Defence Minister and watching the way in which it operates. But you're not able to look at every detail of contract processes. Does that need someone to look at it? Well, you're right. I'm definitely not in a position to see every detail of contracting processes, and I wouldn't assert that I do. But I do think there is considerable oversight in relation to this. But the important point is to make sure that there is never a systemic issue is why we need to be making sure that we're jumping on any issue when it arises, and that's what we've seen in this case. I agree with you. I'm very concerned about the facts of this particular case. It is why we wanted to see the Secretary of the Department refer this to the NAC as quickly as possible. That is what has happened, and it will be fully investigated. Obviously, we'll look at whatever the outcomes of that investigation are. My sense is that there is not a systemic issue, but it's really important that we never see one. What about Thales, though? I mean, it takes two to tango on something like this. Should Defence be doing business with Thales? Well, I mean, Thales are a very important company in terms of the contribution that they provide to the Australian Defence Force. They provide a whole lot of capabilities, for example, both Bushmasters and Hawkeye, along with a number of the munitions, which is what this particular contract was. Is this a black mark against the company? Well, let's see how this plays out. I mean, I'm making it very clear about my concern. We now need to see the process play out and see what it concludes, and I don't want to prejudge that process. Thales is a very important company for Australian defence capability, but there is a process here which needs to run that we are very keen for it to run, and we need to see what the outcome of that process is. Okay, a couple of other issues. Inflation jumped during the week to 4%. Economists predicting we'll see an interest rate rise on the way. Is now really the time to be tipping $23 billion worth of tax cuts into the economy? Well, you're going to see the inflation number, particularly the monthly inflation number, bounce around a bit. But I'd make this point. We have been completely focused in terms of what we are doing to make sure that we are putting downward pressure on inflation. That's why we've delivered 2 surpluses in a row, something that the Liberals never did, something that we haven't seen occur in terms of the management of the federal budget for decades. That's what the Albanese Labor government has done. The second point I'd make is that in terms of the relief that we are putting in place for Australians in terms of the cost of living pressures that they are facing, and from next week you'll see tax cuts being rolled out, you'll see energy relief, you'll see cheaper medicines. But if you take those last 2 as examples, that relief is structured in a way which is about bringing prices down. I mean, bringing the headline inflation number down. Doing. Yeah, but plenty of people point out it. But can I just finish, David? We are structuring our support in terms of bringing prices down in relation to energy, bringing prices down in relation to medicines, and that's an important way in which we are managing the economy. Now, that we are not putting pressure on inflation is something which which has been endorsed by Governor Bullock, that we are easing pricing pressures is something that's been endorsed by both the ABS and the ACCC. Right. So we'll continue to manage the budget in the way in which we can to have a downward pressure on inflation.
Labor Senator Fatima Payman crossed the floor this week to support a motion recognising a Palestinian state. You said there would be no punishment for Senator Payman. Then a few hours later, the Prime Minister did announce a punishment of sorts. What happened there?
Well, we've sought to act with restraint here. I mean, this is a difficult situation. The first point I'd make is in terms of the substantive issue here, we supported in the Senate a motion which would see a recognition of a Palestinian state, but in the context of there being a two-state solution, one which acknowledges Israel's right to exist behind secure borders, and that being pursued in the context of a peace process. Now, that's the position of the Labor Party, and obviously Senator Payman
so what happens now?
Different view.
Yeah, what happens now? Does caucus this week have the power to consider any further sanction or punishment?
Well, caucus is the master of its destiny, and it certainly does have agency here. Can I say we've tried to act with restraint here, and can I explain why? Because we have seen social cohesion in this country put under enormous pressure since October 7 last year, and we wanted to have that guide our actions in this case, and we didn't think that it served to go around expelling people for having a particular view on this issue, and that's why we acted with restraint.
What would happen if
can I just say, as you said, David, as you said, the Prime Minister did speak with Senator Payman, made clear that she should not be attending meetings of the caucus for the rest of this parliamentary session. In terms of what we do going forward, which I think is where you're going with your question, the point I make there is this: we are all members of a team. We only get the privilege of serving in this parliament not because of who we are as individuals, but because when we stand for election, the word Labor is next to our name, and that's obviously the case for Senator Payman as well. She would not be a senator, but for the fact that Labor is next to her name. Without kind of prejudging what may or may not occur in terms of Senator Payman's actions going forward, I cannot overemphasise enough how important all of us who are members of the team regard the obligations of being a member of the team in terms of the way in which we behave.
That sounds like a pretty clear warning.
How we deal with.
No, well, that sounds like a pretty clear warning. If she were to cross the floor again, if the senator were to cross the floor again, what would happen?
Well, let's see what plays out going forward. But I make the point that for all of us who are members of this team, caucus solidarity, what it is to be a member of the team, is fundamentally important to every one of us. It forms it's the heart of the obligations that we have in terms of being members of the Labor Party and being given the great privilege that we have of serving the Australian people in the Parliament. And clearly that will be foremost in the minds of the caucus.
All right. Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks, David.
Well, coming up, we are going to hear from Senator Payman. First, I want to continue this conversation and back to our panel, Mark Kenny, Tom Crowley and Samantha Maiden. And we might get to discussion on this whole issue, and it is a difficult one for Labor once we've heard from Senator Payman. Let's just tick off a couple of other issues in the meantime. We saw an inflation figure this week, in fact, and mentioned it there, and the government's obviously confident that what it's doing isn't going to make the problem worse. But have a look at the monthly data that came out on Wednesday, I think it was. You can see here inflation did come down last year, then went flat, and in the first months of this year, it's just started to tick up a little there. Mark, what's causing that? What's the problem here?
Well, it's obviously a number of structural factors in the economy that are occurring. High demand, higher demand than had been predicted, and I guess you'd have to sort of start to ask the question whether both fiscal and monetary policy settings are contributing to this. Has the Reserve Bank done enough to suppress that demand? I mean, there's a debate now sort of flowing about whether the economy is close to recession or needs to be in recession in order to tame the inflation tiger.
Well, does it, Tom? I mean, this idea that we have to have a recession to get inflation down.
That it now?
Look, I don't think we're quite there yet. And I think, there are always going to be quibbles with these kind of numbers. There's always some economists you can find to tell you you've got to look at this sort of secret other measure of inflation. This number's not as bad as we said it is, etc. I think the key thing, as you see in that graph, is just a series of surprises on the upside, on the hot side, if you like. It's not just inflation. It's the fact that the labour market's still looking pretty strong. It's the fact that there was a revision to the consumption figures a few weeks ago that told us people were still spending a whole lot more than we thought, and they're about to get a big tax cut. I think all of those things clearly now, we've been in this balance. The RBA talks about the narrow path. I like to talk more about a Goldilocks balance between hot and cold. The RBA has been talking about an even balance of hot and cold risks for a while. I think it's sort of tending more towards the hot risk side, and that's the kind of thing that's going to prompt one more rate rise. But Michelle Bullock was very clear at the last meeting that one more rate rise does not mean throw the toys out of the cot, doesn't mean the narrow path's over. It's just a recalibration. It's just keeping us on the narrow path for now. The RBA still thinks maybe one more rate rise is all we might need to keep us on that straight and narrow to get to that inflation in the 2s, unemployment in the 4s, kind of, the just right scenario that we're aiming. So I think, some of the more hawkish commentators are starting to freak out a little bit, and obviously the conversation shifted.
Well, yeah.
I think the biggest thing that would happen with a rate rise would be, it's not earth-shattering in the monetary policy sense, but it would land like an absolute thud for the government. I think the political fallout would be.
And look, obviously the opposition already laying the blame for what's happening with inflation at the government's feet.
The coalition have been saying for some time that this is being driven by that excessive spending.
Yeah, and the Treasurer, just for what it's worth, he's, at least publicly, remaining pretty calm about this. It's a monthly number, it bounces around. The quarterly will be a bit more reliable. And look, pointing to the fact too, and this is some good news for them, they've been able to deliver 2 budget surpluses.
As the Governor of the Reserve Bank has said, the 2 surpluses that we've delivered in the 2 years that we've been in office are helping in the fight against inflation.
And look, they don't hurt, but the question is, will the tax cuts hitting everyone's pockets make the problem
Yeah,
worse?
I mean, the good news about the tax cuts is that, depending obviously on the size of your mortgage and your income, for many families with a dual income, they will wipe out an entire month's worth of average mortgage payments, right? So that's good. That's obviously over the year. You don't get your tax cut in one blob. But, in terms of the interest rates generally, I mean, yes, it is a political problem, 100%. Depends on who you listen to. Some people are suggesting that the RBA has to wait for the retail figures, which are not great. There's a couple more indicators they need to get to before we, work out whether there's an interest rate in August or not. And then, of course, there's what I call the doom lord at the AFR. I really enjoy John Keogh's work, as he knows. He is a bit of a doom lord.
That's unkind.
He's always rounding up all these economists. It's like when he was talking about his dad and COVID. He's a doom lord. I love it.
All right. Well, look, we'll see. Certainly the last thing the government wants is another interest rate rise.
Can we just go to the politics of that for a second? Because, everything about the government's political strategy has been based on this idea that the economy will start to come into that sweet spot toward the end of the year, or at least in the early part of next year. And that's the real challenge of these numbers here, is that it suggests that timetable may no longer be as easily
and that the government doesn't really have this under control.
And this is where I think, it's kind of, I think the government will get blamed for another rate rise. I think in large part that's probably going to be slightly unfair, because economists tend to say that we overstate exactly how much of a role the government has. And even Warren Hogan, who's the most hawkish,
and no doubt they'll point out we haven't gone as high as a lot of other countries with interest rates, right?
Well, that's right.
We've got bigger mortgages than them.
Yeah, we're more sensitive.
We do, but I think the government has been keen to, as you say, Mark, to claim credit for when the fight's been going smoothly. The politics of cost of living are brutal. I think, will it be entirely fair if the government cops it for one more rate rise? Maybe not, but are they going to cop it anyway?
And if there is one, there's probably going to be 2. I mean, that's probably...
this news gets better and better.
Go read the doom lord.
Boy. Look, either way, the PM will be out there all week hammering and selling the tax cuts, the energy bill relief, all those things that kick in from tomorrow. You just wonder whether it is a bit incongruous when everyone's nervous about the prospect of another rate rise. Look, it's hard to believe this was also during the week. It feels like weeks and weeks ago, but the nuclear energy debate was also pretty prominent in Parliament, certainly throughout the week. And the government had a little surprise announcement of its own with a new chair of the Climate Change Authority, no less than the former Liberal Treasurer and Energy Minister in New South Wales, Matt Keane, and he's no fan of nuclear power.
The cheapest way to transition our electricity system is to move towards renewables backed up by firming and also storage. That's what the CSIRO says, that's what AEMO says, that's the evidence available to us. I'm not aware of anything different.
Sam, it didn't go down well with some in the coalition. Barnaby Joyce.
They've never been big fans of Kano.
Called him treacherous, and what was
just for a change?
What was? Why was he chosen? There are plenty of great climate experts out there. Could lead the Climate Change Authority.
Wasn't it?
Is that what it was?
Well, I mean, there might be an element of that. He's a very good communicator. He knows how to handle himself in the public. It's obviously a controversial role. He's in sync policy-wise in this area with the government. He was obviously a very green influence in the New South Wales Liberal government, the Perrottet government and before. So it kind of makes a lot of sense. Although I was asked midweek, you know, how this was going to play out. And I said, well, outside of New South Wales, I don't think too many people have ever heard of him.
How's the nuclear energy debate going, do you think, for both sides this week in Parliament?
Well, I think we've sort of started to finally talk about some other things. I suspect maybe the government realised that after 8 or 9 days where all they were talking about was an opposition policy 9 months out from election, maybe it was time to start talking about something else. I noticed a bit of a shift in the way the government was talking about this. At the beginning, there were all the Simpsons memes and the mockery, and I think they sort of thought they could laugh this idea out of the room. I think they probably started to realise that people who don't know much about the energy debate don't have as many facts in their head as maybe those of us in Canberra do, and they're not aware of all of these issues of cost and timing, etc. And the government seemed to get a little bit, more sober in the way it talked about it. Maybe that's a sign.
I think the government was pretty happy, the opposition was pretty happy that the Assange thing happened, because frankly, it's not in the Parliament that they want to land their nuclear policy. It's very vulnerable to any sort of factual argument.
And certainly,
it's been really struggling. But out there in the electorate, and particularly with young people, ironically, who are kind of used to technological fixes for their lives. They work with technology all the time. They're more inclined to these things. They're aware of the climate change issue. And to have someone stand up and say, hey, here's a zero emissions option, it probably has at least some superficial attraction, which may go some way to explaining why it hasn't sort of been the sort of stink bomb that a lot of people thought it would be out there in the electorate. I think it will probably end up being that, frankly.
Well, we'll see. We'll see. Look, I want to move on, and just a quick mention that for the Insiders on Background podcast this week, speaking of facts, I caught up with the boss of the CSIRO who did that Gen Cost report that showed nuclear would cost a lot more than renewables, went through some of the criticism from Peter Dutton and others, so check that out. Time now, I want to turn to Labor Senator Fatima Payman, who crossed the floor to support a Greens motion in the Senate to recognise the state of Palestine. It is against Labor Party rules to cross the floor, as Richard Marles was telling us. And as Penny Wong pointed out, solidarity is fundamental in the ALP. But Senator Payman clearly has strongly held views on what's happening right now in Gaza.
I was elected to serve the people of Western Australia and uphold the values instilled in me by my late father. Today, I have made a decision that would make him proud and make everyone proud who are on the side of humanity.
Free, free Palestine!
No form of sanction or punishment for the Senator?
No. I met with Senator Payman earlier today. She will not be attending the Labor caucus for the rest of this session.
The fact is that the Senate vote on Tuesday night is inconsequential.
I can understand why colleagues are upset. I can understand how they feel because there is trust between colleagues as well. Our expectation is that the Senator abide by decisions of the caucus.
Senator Payman, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, David.
So will you abide by the decisions of the caucus in the future?
It depends on what is brought forward in the Senate. Obviously, you and I both don't have a crystal ball, so it's really difficult to say. But if the same motion on recognising the state of Palestine was to be brought forward tomorrow, I would cross the floor.
You would cross the floor again?
Yes.
Do you expect it will come forward again?
Well, I haven't been speaking to the Greens, and I think that's a question you can ask the Greens.
But you aren't obviously swayed by Penny Wong, Richard Marles, even the Prime Minister, that you should be following the caucus decision?
I respect the Prime Minister and my senior colleagues, and obviously the Prime Minister had a stern but fair conversation with me a few days ago, and I understand that he's got, very important decisions to make as the leader of our nation.
Stern but fair was the punishment, if we can call it that, of suspending you from caucus for a week. Was that fair?
Well, that's the prerogative and the decision that the Prime Minister came to. And, you know, when I made the decision on the Senate floor to cross, I did it with the understanding that this could lead to expulsion and costing my Labor membership.
So you knew that was the price, but you were willing to pay it, to vote the way that you did. Do you expect any further sanction from the caucus this week?
That's up to the caucus to decide. But what I know is this is about 40,000 Palestinians that have been massacred and slaughtered since 7th of October. And I know that Australians are a fair people, and knowing about the Labor Party, we are a party with a conscience and champions of human rights, whether that be justice, fighting for freedom or equality. So I believe that I've been abiding by those principles of the party.
There is a clear principle and rule in the party that you can't cross the floor. Can I ask, are you intending to leave the party over this, to quit the party?
I just want to make an interesting clarification here. What do you mean by the party? Because the party to me are rank and file members, are unionists, are phone bankers, door knockers, long life members of the party who put together the platform. What you're referring to is the caucus, and the decisions that the caucus make obviously is up to them. But I do not intend on leaving the party, because I firmly believe that I've upheld all the values of what, as the Labor Party, we should stand for. So
you think the membership is with you rather than the caucus?
Well, I've been so blessed, and it's unbelievable to receive the support that I have. It's quite overwhelming, actually, whether it be from my West Australian constituents or from around the nation, New South Wales, Victoria. It has been, you know, such an honour, but also it's humbling, and I hope to pay back the public for their solidarity.
But just to be clear, you said you don't have any intention of leaving the party, of quitting the caucus.
No, I do not have any intention.
You want to stay?
I do.
Okay. Do you accept what Richard Marles said earlier about you wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the Labor Party, you wouldn't have the Senate seat? Do you accept that?
Look, the Labor Party, as I mentioned, what it comprises of, but also when it comes to my election, we know that the 47th Parliament has been the most diverse parliament ever, and you can't have that diversity in personalities and the representation, but not have the diversity of views and opinions. And I think it's important for us to consider that, you know, modern day Australia looks very different to what it did 20, 30 years ago, and it's going to keep evolving that way.
And this is a really interesting point. Obviously, Labor champions diversity. Are you saying that they're not, in practice, accepting what that means in terms of votes like this?
Look, we've had diverse views in the caucus from, you know, various people, various perspectives on the table, but I think that we need to be able to embrace that, that diversity of views.
Okay, let me ask you about your actual position. You talked about civilians being massacred in Gaza. Israel, of course, denies this is a genocide. It says it is simply responding to the Hamas attack of October 7. You've faced criticism for using the phrase, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, including from your colleague Ed Husic. The phrase has different meanings for different people. What do you mean by it?
For me, it means freedom from violence, freedom from oppression, and freedom from inequality. And this is the right of Palestinians to self-determine their futures and their aspirations. And like I've mentioned in the press conference, you can't want to have a two-state solution and advocate for it without recognising one of those two states.
Do you support a two-state solution?
I do.
So you do support the continued existence of the State of Israel, of a Jewish homeland state?
Yep, and I think that the Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side.
So from the river to the sea still means the State of Israel exists?
Yes, that, obviously the Likud party charter says otherwise. They only want Israeli sovereignty.
And on the other side, Hamas does not want a State of Israel to exist.
Well, this isn't about Hamas. You know, the Palestinian people are not all represented by Hamas. And, I mean, we can draw upon what's been happening in the West Bank, 8,800 Palestinians being detained with no reasoning or trial. You know, so if we want the hostages to be released by Hamas in Gaza, we also need to expect that from, for the Israeli government to release the 8,800 Palestinian hostages in West Bank.
Just finally, and to sum this up, you intend to stay in the party, but you're open to crossing the floor again on a similar motion on this issue. How are your colleagues treating you over the past week?
Look, it's been a mix of reactions. I understand there's been various colleagues who have been upset with me and frustrated. I've received the cold shoulder, but there has been an overwhelming majority who have stood up in solidarity doing their welfare checks. And I know there are caucus members who have advocated for this matter longer than I've been on this earth for. And, something as mentioned by the Foreign Minister and my WA Senate colleague Louise Pratt, that they've been advocating for the same-sex marriage. And
they had to vote against it because it was the view of caucus.
I understand. And their advocacy from within, it took 10 years to legislate same-sex marriage. We're talking about 40,000 Palestinians being massacred here. These Palestinians do not have 10 years. And so that's why I will use what is within my power as a backbench senator to continue advocating for a just and lasting solution. And I think that's what fair Australians want. And that's what I've been talking to people on the ground in Western Australia, whether they be rank and file members or the locals, and that's what I've been hearing.
Senator Fatima Payman, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
Now, we will get to talking pictures with Mike Bowers very shortly, but we're going to, of course, discuss what we've just heard there. And just to point out, the factions of the Labor Party are due to meet tomorrow, and then the caucus meeting, the scheduled caucus meeting, happens on Tuesday. And let's just get some thoughts on this from Mark Kenny, Tom Crowley and Samantha Maiden once again. Mark, what do you make of that? I mean, the fact that the Senator has just been speaking out further on her position and making it clear she's prepared to do it again.
Well, first thing I'd say is I thought that was a pretty impressive performance, and I think she articulates her position quite well. She indicated her desire to stay, strong commitment to stay within the Labor Party, but I think her point about diversity is a very good one. This is what diversity looks like. I mean, you look at her and think about where she came from, Afghan refugee. She's a Muslim woman, a young woman. She is looking at this issue. She talks about the time frame that is associated with this issue, the urgency to do something about it right now. She's for the two-state solution. That is Labor Party policy. People need to remember this. This is firm Labor Party. She has crossed the floor to reflect Labor Party policy, not Labor Party tactics. And I'm not entirely sure that this position that the caucus had adopted was as a result of the Greens bill going to the caucus.
Well, in fairness, the position mirrors Penny Wong's position that she's been articulating for months, doesn't it? That they're open to considering recognising a Palestinian state if it can progress a peaceful outcome, and that's been pretty
correct.
Clear
and that was the nature of the Labor amendment that was unsuccessful in that process, which I think she sat out.
But there's no doubt that she was defying the will of caucus in crossing the floor.
Yes, but as I was just saying, I'm not entirely sure that the normal thing that would happen when you're considering a caucus position, if you do it properly and formally, is that the motion itself that's about to be debated would go to a full caucus meeting, not be told by the leadership, this is the line we're taking.
All right.
Look,
well, what happens now?
In terms of, look, what happens now is, I mean, that was an incredibly defiant interview. And
the fact she's done it at all.
And the fact that she's done it at all, I mean, that was really, a statement of war, really, on the Labor caucus. I mean, what she's saying is, you don't tell me what to do, you can't dictate to me. I have a sort of main line to the members, and of course we've already seen that she's got the support of some unions in relation to this. So,
and this is really difficult for Anthony Albanese.
That's not a conciliatory, I mean, no offence, that's not a conciliatory interview there. I mean, she's saying, I've done it once, I'll do it again. And
the members are with me.
And the members are with me.
But what's interesting as well is that that's exactly what it seems like the Prime Minister was trying to avoid at the beginning of the week when he went out really quickly. And it seems almost that it sort of started to kick into a different gear when backbenchers started backgrounding and saying, we're not happy about this, we're going to pursue this further in caucus. That seemed to really change her reaction, and the temperature of it seemed to rise really quickly there. It's interesting that Labor MPs have been saying all sorts of things publicly that differ from the government's position outside of Parliament. It just goes to show this kind of article of faith within the Labor Party and how how strongly people seem to react within the caucus to doing it on the parliament. And it's I mean, the motion itself was a bit of parliamentary theatre and symbolism, but for the Labor Party, it clearly just it means.
So Senator Payman wants to stay in the Labor Party. Do you think she will?
Well, she can if she wants.
But do you think how this plays out? I mean, how will caucus react?
I think she probably will, but it does depend on a bit of skullduggery from the Greens, whether they're going to push this again, whether they're going to try and put her in a position where she has to either sort of live up to what she just said to you in that interview.
What, you think they're not going to?
Yeah, precisely. Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah. But what about for the Prime Minister too? And you know, we could hear it from Richard Marles a little earlier as well, acknowledging how the social cohesion issue around this whole war in Gaza and how sensitively they're treating. I mean, in years gone by, you cross the floor, you're out. This one, they've a very mild slap on the wrist.
They're scared of it.
And the issue and how it's going to play.
Yeah, and the issue, because there are a lot of Muslim voters, and particularly in a number of Western Sydney seats.
And a lot of talk about running pro-Palestinian independent candidates in those seats, like Jason Clare's seat of Blackslap.
Precisely, so that's an issue. The other thing I thought was really interesting about all of this, as we saw it play out over the week, was the number of people who came out demanding that she be kicked out from the Labor Party for breaching solidarity, who most of the time spend their time criticising the Labor Party for not allowing its members to cross the floor. And that goes as a criticism for a number of journalists as well. I just thought it was...
But you also had the likes of Penny Wong making that point pretty clear as well and reflecting on her own experience, under the Gillard government when she had to vote against same-sex marriage.
Yeah, and as a very senior figure, and as she said...
She chose to follow and fight internally to shift the party's position.
It worked eventually, right? Yes, and she was a senior figure, and I don't think you could say that of Senator Payman. I'm not saying she couldn't have done this a different way, but I think she's accounted for herself quite well in terms of her articulation of it just then.
Look, the sequence of events here is that she did what she did. Anthony Albanese and Richard Marles clearly underestimated caucus anger. Then they had to reframe this. She hasn't been kicked out of one caucus meeting. It's actually two because she can't go to the Senate meeting either. But who cares?
Senate caucus, okay.
Yeah, but no, I take your point. But
that one.
But the bottom line here is that this is going to be a huge problem for Anthony Albanese because he looks weak if he doesn't take action, and if he does take action, it'll inflame the situation.
Just what he needs in the last week of Parliament before the long winter break. All right, our panel, Samantha Maiden, Tom Crowley and Mark Kenny, will be back very shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with political reporter for 9 News, the one and only Amanda Copp, and a very warm welcome back to this very chilly Canberra morning.
Always cold out here, Mike.
No matter where you land on Julian Assange, the one thing we can agree on, he's now a free man, and it did feel like a very historic moment.
Yeah, I thought it was beautiful, straight off the plane and into the arms of his wife and to the cheers of his supporters.
Yeah.
Tell you what, the Canberra airport's probably not the best one to come into when you've spent 14 years away.
I know, right? He acknowledged the crowd with fist pumping.
It was this strange tension between, wanting to keep the US happy, acknowledging that there'd been some kind of concessions made, but also, celebrating the fact that we've got an Australian citizen home who's been away for a really long time.
But imagine being on that plane.
Apparently it was the same plane that Taylor Swift flew in on.
Well, there you go. Shake it off. Harry Bruce did this wonderful cartoon where he's channeling the Shawshank Redemption.
You would not believe what I've had to crawl through.
And Albo's got his little towel here, which is lovely.
I think he's going to need a bigger towel.
I think he's going to need a bit of a wash by the look of it. The human element was brought home to me when it was revealed that he had said to the Prime Minister when he called that he had saved his life. And I think Kathy's sort of captured that beautifully with the Belmarsh prison and the loss of feathers.
Yeah, and there's a bit of symbolism going on here as well. The dove, usually a symbol of innocence.
Yeah. Very powerful Matt Golding cartoon. Enough is enough.
He's served his time for our crimes. And the real question here is, who was the one committing crimes here? The country that was committing crimes or the person who revealed them?
No matter what you think about Julian, he revealed some pretty shocking evidence of what had gone on.
Absolutely.
A lovely Mark Knight cartoon here. It looks like the Prime Minister wants to be the first to welcome you home, Mr. Assange.
Who's saving who in this case? Poor old Albo clinging to inflation. Things are burning down around him. Help!
Did you miss us? As the little kicker down there. David Rowe, I think, has the life of Julian Canberra. He's not the Messiah.
He's just a very naughty journalist.
And we've got all the leaders and prime ministers here who have been responsible while he's there. But I love this. Here's Tony Abbott looking up at his Speedo.
They were very specific about the location here, the East Hotel. Although I got to say, I was staked out the front of the East Hotel for many, many hours, and we didn't see Julian Assange.
No. Amanda, the ALP doesn't allow its MPs to cross the floor. You've got to sort of maintain party lines.
It's a massive risk for Fatima Payman here. Traditionally, what happens is people get kicked out of the party.
David Pocock, the independent from the ACT, sort of escorted her from where she was sitting up the back.
She said that it was one of the hardest things she's had to do.
Yeah. I did love this, David Pope. It's very poignant. Although each step across the Senate floor felt like a mile, I know I did not walk alone, as she's got some ghostly accompanying here.
You know, we sit here and think about the kind of political argy-bargy, the consequences for the party, but really what she's talking about here, or what she was standing for, is the people who are dying over in Palestine.
Yeah, that's right. The decision by the coalition to go nuclear has cast a long shadow, and it's still creating ripples.
It sure is. Nuclear shockwaves. And we've got here a three-eyed omelette.
David Rowe, beautiful cartoon, morning elbow.
You'd think the Lodge would have better security, Mike.
Lovely Megan Hergen, how to cook Australia's energy transition. Select one simple potato.
Nuke it.
And stick a fork in it, it's done.
Kind of looks like coal to me.
It's definitely channeling the this is coal from Scott Morrison. Lovely Matt Golding cartoon, nuclear policy homework.
Beautifully coloured in unicorn there.
Absolutely.
She's still missing cost, design model, nuclear waste storage, realistic timelines, 2030 emissions target and community consultation.
I declare this is all my own work, signed Peter Dutton. Lastly, Amanda, John Kudelka has a warning for all fossil fuel producers.
Anything we need to worry about?
Extreme heat events, cyclones, fire, flood, famine, plague, mass extinction, collapse of the biosphere.
I meant the 7-day forecast, smartass.
Well, thanks, Amanda. It's been a very historic week in Canberra. I'll let you do the honours.
Thank you very much, Mike. Back to you, Spearsy.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Mike. Time for some final observations. Quick one from me. Canberra's Night of Nights, the Press Gallery Midwinter Ball, is on Wednesday night this week. In fact, the 25th anniversary of the Midwinter Ball. They've raised more than $5 million for some terrific charities over all those years. And one of the features that raises a fair bit of dough each year is the charity auction, and the website's on the screen there. If you would like to take part, you can bid on a meal with the Prime Minister and Jodie Hayden at the Lodge or Kirribilli House, a meal with Peter Dutton and two of his colleagues at one of Canberra's finest restaurants, or even dinner at the Press Club with 4 influential journalists. I reckon that one will surely go for the outbid the others, no doubt about it. Anyway, you can take part. Just follow that website to the Midwinter Ball. Sam.
Well, a couple of Labor frontbenchers that I spoke to last night said that they didn't think that the Senator Payman issue was going to end well. It was up to her where it goes, but they thought she probably wanted to end up on the crossbench. And after that interview, I think they're right.
Tom.
French elections later today, and in both France and Germany we're seeing an interesting phenomenon where young people are very strongly supporting some of the far-right parties that are expected to do well. That's always kind of been a thing in Europe. It's starting to happen in America as well, where it hasn't really been a thing, that Donald Trump is doing a lot better with Gen Z voters than he ever has before. We haven't really seen that much of it in Australia, but Patricia Karvelas pointed out this week that there is a split between young men and young women on nuclear, and on a lot of other issues we're starting to see that sort of split along young gender lines. It's just a reminder that young people aren't a monolith.
Yeah, really interesting point.
Really interesting figures, that. Just on election funding, there was meant to be election funding reform that was going to be introduced into the Parliament this term. My understanding is it'll be in the first week of after the winter break. A few details about it. There's going to be spending caps, it looks like. There's also going to be donation thresholds changes so that you have to declare donations not over $16,000 but over $1,000, which is pretty interesting. And real-time disclosure, probably 7 days would be the figure. That's what I'm hearing. And just quickly, if I could say, sad passing of Judith Whelan. She was the one of 3 women editors of the Sydney Morning Herald. I worked with her. A number of people did. Anyone who worked with her loved her. She was an extraordinary person, a great journalist, a great editor, and she'll be missed.
Yeah, and sadly missed at the ABC as well.
Yeah.
Well said, Mark. Thank you all very much for joining us on a jam-packed show this morning. Finally, Labor's Dan Rippercoli may have missed out on a berth at his 6th Olympics for pistol shooting, but he did win something during the week. A competition run by Dietitians Australia to pack the most delicious and nutritious lunchbox. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
Dan.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you enjoy your lunch. And I'm going to hold this until next year's one. So the winner will get it from then on as well.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.